There is real fear stalking the Jewish neighbourhoods of Britain. Jewish people here are becoming fearful of showing themselves. In Britain, in 2023. My Jewish grandparents loved Britain, believing the Jews were more welcome here than in most countries. I'm glad they aren't alive now to read newspaper stories that would have reminded them of the 1930s Europe that they left.
I mean, that's powerful stuff that we hear there from Stephen Fry. He's glad his grandparents aren't here, a place where they sought sanctuary. He's glad they're not here today to see what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of distress in this moment. And, you know, as someone whose grandparents also left Europe after the war, I think there is this sense now, is this the worst it's been since those times? And I completely understand the distress that a lot of people are feeling. And, you know, I felt it as well. And people are having a very difficult moment, I think. But I think in terms of thinking about the opportunities and the solutions in this time, it's like, what are the sort of different forces at B that are allowing anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and Islamophobia to be so prominent in this moment? And thinking about how do we build a better future in the UK, like in order to protect multiple different minorities. And one of the ways we do that is recognizing that anti-Semitism often flares up both in terms of social inequality and unrest, but also alongside other forms of prejudice. We know that. We know that also that many Jewish people in the UK also have different intersecting identities, Black Jews, queer Jews, who've also experienced racism and discrimination in different forms. So the way to address this is a way that is about prioritizing the needs of minoritized communities and fighting for collective liberation, alongside other groups such as Muslim communities who are also experiencing harm at this moment.
Okay, let's bring back in our panel here in the studio as well. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo is with us, and Jonathan Lis. I mean, Jonathan, just listening to, I cited the David Baddiel book and Stephen Fry kind of echoing that point there as well, as two high-profile Jewish men. You're Jewish yourself. Do you recognise how that was articulated by Stephen Fry?
I think that in moments like this, it's really important to have a clear head and just to sometimes, when you take a step back and you see what's happening, to look things absolutely clearly, what is happening, how alarmed do we need to be, but also just occasionally to maybe dial down the rhetoric and say that objectively Jews are not facing an existential threat in this country. There has been an increase in attacks, which is horrific and very, very worrying. And, you know, I say this as someone whose nephews go to a Jewish school, and so I'm fully aware of what's going on in that sphere. And, you know, I do, you know, security duty at a synagogue that I belong to sort of once or twice a year. So I'm aware, and always have been aware of the kind of the distinctive threats that face the Jewish community. But I also think that it doesn't do anyone any favours to kind of build this narrative that Jews are somehow being driven from their homes, that we're sort of facing sort of 19th century style pogroms, or sort of 1930s German style pogroms even in this country.
Which is pretty much what Stephen Fry said.
And I look, with the greatest respect, I would not use that language myself.
So you don't recognise that personally?
I don't recognise that. Look,
but there will be other Jews that clearly do, Jonathan.
Clearly some people do. Look, I'm not a sort of a Jewish person who goes around wearing a kippah, for example. And I have to say that I probably would never have wanted to do that. I actually think that people are quite brave to do that, because I've never wanted to draw attention to my identity, you know, because I don't want to draw attention to myself in that way, because there is anti-Semitism. Even if I'm not a religious Jewish person at all, but if I was, I just think that I would think twice about doing that. And that's a terrible thing. That's a terrible thing to have to say. And in the current situation, I understand why people wouldn't.
So you wouldn't have done that anyway because of this?
Through, like, at any time in my life, I would not have wanted to do that because you know,
you felt you would be a target.
Absolutely. The anti-Semitism has always been around.
Sure.
You know, I remember sort of when I was a teenager, a friend of mine had a kippah, and I saw kind of the comments that were sometimes shouted out of cars at him when I was standing next to him, and I saw how uncomfortable.
But that is outrageous.
Of course
it is. You feel like
of course
that.
it is. But I'm saying it's not.
I mean,
it's not happening.
But then you're also talking about dialing down.
It's not anything new. But
the narrative. That's huge. If we were talking about a woman in a burqa or something like that, we would be having a national debate.
Absolutely. But I think that we should have national debates about that. We should always have national debates about this. The question is that we're having now about whether Jewish people are facing an existential threat. I never said that my friend was being sort of threatened, was having his life threatened. He, obviously, he occasionally had comments made at him which were horrible and very, very unsettling and distressing. But there is a difference between that and actually facing an existential threat. They are not facing an existential threat as Jewish people in this country.
OK, Rafe, what do you make of this? What is demonstrably a worrying rise in anti-Semitic crime?
Well, that's just it. There are degrees of magnitude. I mean, the experiences you would have had 20 or 30 or 40 years ago pale into insignificance compared to what we're seeing today on the streets of London, for example. Jews won't go walking through Whitechapel or Bethnal Green if they're visibly Jewish. Every Saturday they're scared to come into the centre of town, and we need to call it out for what it is. When I remember when I was at school studying the Second World War and at university, the sadness and disbelief I had looking at the anti-Jewish graffiti on the streets of Germany, people being pushed on the streets for being Jewish. We're seeing precisely those things now. And it's not a question of dialing down the rhetoric. We're not saying that right now there's an existential threat to Jews. But this is about warning signs. This is about the sign of things to come. Anti-Semitism has been festering under the surface in major cities in this country, in the north of England and London, for a good couple of decades. It's taken this to actually make the wider population aware to quite what a threat it is, and I think it needs to be addressed dramatically because, Britain was, as Stephen Fry said, for 200 years, since the Russian pogroms of the 1830s, Britain, London in particular, was a safe haven and a sanctuary for Jews, and to see these scenes on the streets of London, you import the world, and you import the world's problems, and we're seeing played out on the streets of London the conflicts of the Middle East.
Yeah, and Emily, just to bring Emily Hilton back into this, is there I don't imagine there's a short answer to this. Is there a way that we can begin the inroads to educating people? What is it? Because there's clearly, as you rightly said, I think a moment ago, there's a conflation with what is happening in Israel, and as if every Jew in this country is somehow responsible or somehow, tacitly or otherwise connected to the war efforts of the Israeli government. Is it that? Does that have to stop before people stop their hate over here, or is there something else that can be done?
To what the last speaker said about particularly around sort of Jewish people not feeling safe walking through areas like Bethnal Green or central London. I have been going to every one of the Palestine Solidarity March with as part of the Jewish bloc, and that this has been something that has been a very important part of our activism and organizing in this time. It's incredibly important that we do not suggest that sort of Jewish safety and Palestinian solidarity or human rights and freedom are mutually exclusive goals. If anything, they are interconnected, and it's very important that we address that and challenge the assumptions that we have to pit different communities against each other. That is sort of in part why we are where we are in this moment. I think in terms of inroads, I think it's similar to what Jonathan said, but also I think education is really clear. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are structural problems. They're systemic problems. We won't address them simply only by hate crime legislation or targeting individuals. We need to think about anti-Semitism as a systemic problem that requires systemic solutions. And one of those is education, and the other is building relationships and sort of joint coalitions with different communities across differences that exist in society. And I think that for me feels absolutely crucial. How do we fight for a world in which everyone feels free and safe, no matter where they live? Is something that I feel very passionate about, and I hope to take that into this long-term struggle against anti-Semitism in the UK and also beyond.